Okay, so this is another assumptions problem. This is exam 47, section 2, question 12. So the problem is the conclusion drawn above follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. So we have the archaeologists are discovering a great deal about the Salas culture. For example, recent excavations have unearthed smelting furnaces and tools of smelted copper and bronze. There were distinct Sal's words for copper and bronze, so distinct, but none for iron. Thus, the Sal did not smelt iron. Okay, so there's a culture with uh, bronze and copper tools, and they have words for copper and bronze, but no words for iron. So that means they did not smelt iron, right? So there's a connection here between uh, things that they have words for, and things that they don't have words for, right? Because they have copper and bronze, and they have words for copper and bronze, and they don't have a word for iron, and that must mean that they didn't smelt iron, basically. So let's look at A. If a culture had a distinct word for a metal, then it smelted that metal. Okay, that seems good. That seems pretty much what we were talking about. B. If a culture was unfamiliar with a metal, then it did not have a distinct word for that metal. So this seems like it might be a good idea, right? Because it's they're unfamiliar with it, and so then they did not have a distinct word. The problem is we don't know that for sure, right? Our argument doesn't necessarily talk about that. It more uh, so so B is like, so if it's unfamiliar with a metal, then it did not have a distinct word for that metal. However, we're not saying the Sal's were unfamiliar with iron, right? The question is not whether they knew iron existed or not. It's more whether they smelted it, right? So that's the problem with B. So it seems correct, but this unfamiliarity is the issue here. Let's look at C. If a culture smelted copper and bronze, then it had distinct words for copper and bronze. So that is obviously true for this, right? At least that Sal's had a distinct word for them and they smelted them. But that doesn't help us deal with iron, so that's pretty irrelevant. It's kind of an easy one to mark off. D seems pretty similar. So if a culture did not smelt a metal, then it was unfamiliar with that metal. However, it's the same thing as B, right? Where this unfamiliarity becomes an issue for us because we're not talking about whether or not the Sal's were unfamiliar with iron, right? We don't know if they had discovered it or not. It's more about whether they smelted it. And then we have E. So if a culture smelted a metal, then it had a distinct word for that metal. Ooh, now this seems interesting too, because that means that they didn't smelt. They did not have a word for iron, so they did not smelt iron, right? So E seems like a good answer too. So let's go back up to A, because it looks like we have down to these two answers. So A, if a culture had a distinct word for a metal, then it smelted that metal. And B is if a culture smelted a metal, then it had a distinct word for that metal, right? So it's the exact same thing, but like switched around, right? So they're both the contrapositives of each other, I guess. Now the question is, which one is correct? Do we care about the fact that they had a word for it and did not smelt it? Or if they smelted it, they had a word for it? So when we're looking at the problem, there were distinct words for copper and bronze, right? And then they smelted copper and bronze. But they did not have a word for iron, so they did not smelt iron. Which could seem like, again, it could be either one of these. So here we basically have a sufficient and a necessary issue, right? Because it's clear that there's metal and the word, and here again, metal and the word. And we want to know which order, how to order the thing, right? Whether the word goes first. So like, if we have a word for it, then we smelt it, or is it if we smelt it, then we have a word for it? But we're focusing on the conclusion here, right? So the Sal's did not smelt iron. So that pretty much shows us that it's iron that goes to the word, right? So it's if the culture smelted it, then they had a word for it. Because the conclusion is that they did not smelt iron because they did not have a word for it, right? So that gives the city E, where if the culture smelted a metal, then they had a word for it, right? Because we know that the South did not smelt iron, so they did not have a word for it. Let's see if that's correct, and it is E.